Good morning,
Good morning.
and welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Society of Schenectady and our Sunday worship service here on February 18th. I am the Reverend Wendy Bartel. Please use my name rather than pronouns, and I serve as one of the co-ministers here, along with Reverend Lynn Gardner, who uses she or they pronouns. And we are so grateful that you have chosen to be here this morning, whether in this circle or here on Zoom in our Zoom sanctuary. Or maybe perhaps you're viewing this later on some form of social media. Greetings to you as well. We offer an especially warm welcome to those of you visiting us for the first time. We really are glad for your presence here. We know that our circle gets made better every time we welcome somebody new into it. Our reading this morning is from Julian Jamaica Soto, which is a new chosen name from their book of poetry called Spilling the Light. They write, "To be free, you must embrace the breadth of your own existence without apology, even if they try to take it from you. You must know not that you can do whatever you want. You are not a kudzu vine eating entire hillsides for the purpose of feeding your own lush life. You must know instead that inside you are entire universes, milky blue, magenta, gold, expanding. But to actually be free, you must know and you must fight for the entire universes inside of everyone else. Being free is not a license, but a promise."
Unitarian Universalism doesn't have a creed or a single theology that everyone is required to believe. We do have some shared values. For the past couple of years, there's been a lot of work done to name and explicitly articulate some of our core values as a denomination, and lots of opportunities to participate in that process. These shared values, with love at the center, are interdependence, pluralism, generosity, transformation, justice, and equity. Many of you have seen this graphic. The proposed revisions to Article 2 of the Unitarian Universalist Association bylaws will be voted on at this June's General Assembly. Each month, we've been exploring a different facet of these proposed changes. And in February, as you may have noticed over the past couple of weeks, we're digging into equity and justice. Now, one of the important things to understand about Unitarian Universalism is that we are a tradition with congregational polity. That's the fancy way of saying that every congregation has the right and the responsibility to elect their own leaders, to call a minister or ministers if they choose, to set their own budget, raise their own money, create their own mission, and figure out how to best live into it. And each congregation is in relationship with all the other congregations, together creating the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations, or the UUA. And we have a shared covenant with the other UU congregations, as expressed in the 7 principles and our 6 sources. Earlier this morning, we shared a story about Harriet Tubman, whose values and commitments informed and shaped how she lived. The proposed language of Article 2 centers on these shared values, how each value is expressed through covenant, through commitments that we make and are asked to return to again and again. Justice. We work to be diverse, multicultural, beloved communities where all thrive. We covenant to dismantle racism and all forms of systemic oppression. We support the use of inclusive democratic processes to make decisions within our congregations, our association, and society at large. Equity. We declare that every person has the right to flourish with inherent dignity and worthiness. We covenant to use our time, wisdom, attention, and money to build and sustain fully accessible and inclusive communities. These are not small commitments. Our covenants can serve to both inspire and guide our actions. If we covenant to dismantle racism and all forms of systemic oppression, it will be a lifelong journey, not something that we get to check off next Tuesday or next year. It means living our lives in different ways. If we're going to truly be an accessible and inclusive congregation, we have a ways to go. While this can feel daunting, it also gives me great hope. We know that others before us have yearned for justice and have worked with courage and creativity, bringing greater equity to communities and congregations. And far too often, the values and commitments have not been widely shared.
We kindled our chalice with words by the Reverend Egbert Ethelred Brown. As we face a troubled and puzzled world, we too are troubled and puzzled. Born in Jamaica in 1875 as the eldest of 5 children, his family would move to Montego Bay and he would stop using Egbert as a youth, preferring to go by Ethelred. In 1894, according to the New York Public Library archives, at age 19, Ethelred placed 3rd in an island-wide civil service placement examination. In 1898, with a steady job, he married Ella Matilda Wallace, a childhood friend. He'd be promoted a year later. By 1907, he and his wife had 4 children, and he was dismissed from the civil service, and I could not find out why. But according to the archive, he saw this change of fortune, which he later termed as both tragic and providential, and took it as a sign to enter the ministry. An uncle had exposed Ethelred to the Unitarian faith. Brown had worked in Methodist churches as a lay preacher and a musician, but doctrinally the Unitarian church was a much better fit for him. It was not an easy journey. He wrote to Meadville Theological School in Pennsylvania as referred by Reverend George Badger, who was the then secretary of the Fellowship Committee of the American Unitarian Association, the AUA. Remember, this is a long time ago, before the merger. Brown requested enrollment with the intention to be ordained. The New York Public Library Archive reports that though accepted to enroll in the fall of 1907, upon entering the U.S., Brown was immediately deported to Jamaica as a contracted alien. His second attempt to return to the U.S. was stopped at the 11th hour by his father, who took back the money he had given his son for the trip. Ethelred had to continue working as an assistant accountant for another year to pay for his passage to the U.S. He would arrive and be allowed to begin his studies, finally, in September of 1910. And ordained in 1912, where he returned to Jamaica to bring Unitarianism there, with 2 years in Montego Bay and 6 in Kingston. But alas, financial and church problems forced the family to relocate to the U.S. in 1920. Soon after he arrived in New York, he founded the Harlem Community Church, in honor, according to the library archive, of John Haynes Holmes, the only ministerial friend in those early days, who was a Unitarian minister in New York. In 1928, just 8 years later, Brown would change the name of the church to the Hubert Harrison Memorial Church, a temple and a forum. in honor of the late orator and writer from the then Dutch West Indies, Hubert Harrison. The name of the church was then changed again in 1937 to the Haarlem Unitarian Church. Now, some of you may be familiar with the Reverend Dr. Mark Morrison Reed in collecting the stories of Black UUs and significant events in our history. In his more recent book, Darkening the Doorways, Black Trailblazers and Missed Opportunities in Unitarian Universalism, Morrison Reed notes that throughout the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, in what many considered the capital of the Black world, Brown's Haarlem Unitarian Church was a center of Black radical discourse. But running a church is not easy to do, and money is essential. Brown regularly solicited the American Unitarian Association and other sources for funds and support. And as Morrison Reed writes, Brown's politics may have left the AUA officials aghast, but the correspondence indicates little awareness of his status in Haarlem. Rather, its officials, annoyed with his ongoing solicitation for support, viewed him as such a nuisance that in 1929, after several earlier attempts, dropped him from ministerial fellowship. Now, E. Ethelred Brown could have given up on Unitarianism, gone back to Methodists, or looking elsewhere. But he somehow kept his heart open to continue to answer the call to be a Unitarian minister. And in 1935, with assistance and support from the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, legal action was noted and threatened, and Brown's fellowship was reinstated. Morrison Reed acknowledged that with the election in 1937 under the AUA presidency of Frederick May Elliott, the association's attitudes towards African Americans began to change. This reformation, which grew stronger throughout the 1940s, is evident in the 1942 AUA General Assembly resolution on race relations. It is clear from some of the text I read that the impact of the racist ideology of World War II caused many liberal faith communities to start to examine themselves in a new way, especially white segregated settings. While some things improved and more congregations did begin to integrate, Brown and the congregation in Haarlem would continue to struggle financially. Somehow, though, with every obstacle throughout his journey, somehow he managed to write those words we heard at the beginning of the service. Now, you may adjust for your own theological stance, but in Brown's theological stance, he said, as our fond dreams remain unrealized and our bright hopes of yesterday wither in the bitter disappointments of today, our courage fails, our spirits droop, our faith trembles, and frustrated we bow our heads in despair. Nevertheless, we come to God in this hour of worship, in this house of prayer. As we pray for peace in our time, O God, may we ourselves be at peace with the world, with ourselves, and with Thee. May we know that without love there will never be peace. Teach us, therefore, to love. You've got to keep your heart wide open, though the waves want to push you around. It can be hard to learn about some of our history, the ways that we have failed. But I'm pretty sure that it's better to know the truth and find ourselves uncomfortable than it is to think that we have the race thing all figured out because we have a banner on our building. Some might say, can't we just leave the past in the past? Some folks are trying to pretend that this country doesn't have a horrible history of enslavement. They don't want their white kids to be uncomfortable, so it is better to erase the woefully abhorrent treatment of West African people who were stolen and enslaved in this country and the legacies of impact that exist today. To not teach the hatred-infused Holocaust that sparked World War II. To not teach about Stonewall and marriage equality. To undermine democracy. We cannot let them do that. Knowing about our history can, if we put in the work, help us to not repeat it. And it is imperative that we not repeat much of it, and that we do better than we are doing right now to recognize the systems that disempower and disenfranchise far too many people from striving to make things more just and more equitable. Knowing about the brokenness of our past, we can invite ourselves into a sense of compassion, because there's brokenness in the present, too. We are human. And we will, from time to time, unintentionally perhaps, perpetuate racist ideas or sexist behaviors or transphobia or anti-Semitism or Islamophobia or ableism, etc. But we can do better. And we can help one another if we're willing to examine our beliefs, question our assumptions, and ask ourselves to live more fully into our faith's values and covenants, so that when we know better, we actually do better. Eventually, at the age of 65, Ethelred became eligible for a pension, which he received until his death in 1956. It was too little too late, but it was some movement in the right direction. What do we need to learn right here about how to do better? The reading about freedom from Julian Jamaica Soto, who has chosen that new name from one many of us have heard as you have shared their poetry for several years, reminds us you must know and you must fight for the entire universes inside of everyone else. Julian has a great article in the UU World magazine referring to their identity as disabled, and at least one way we could learn to do better with our welcome. They write in that article, "One way to describe my disability is as lifelong, but I slightly prefer factory installed. That is, I'm built this way. I experienced the UUA's General Assembly and other large gatherings through that factory installation, as well as those of being brown-skinned and queer. I am all of these all the time." They continue, "Sources estimate that 20% of any group is disabled. What may vary among people with disabilities is what role this feature plays in their lives. For me, being disabled is part of a larger politicized identity. When I try to attend events without cutouts, leaving space for my mobility scooter, I don't just feel sad, as though exclusion simply hurts my feelings. Rather, I understand that Unitarian Universalism sometimes defaults to a narrative that makes disabled people invisible and troublesome simultaneously." Their article continues, acknowledging the accessibility team at GA, the General Assembly, and the good work done, while also inviting the rest of us who attend GA or any other public gathering to consider making sure that there are cutouts where scooters can fit. In the before times, Lynn and I used to move these chairs on the top row to make sure of that. And I realized in preparation for this service that we haven't done that since we reopened. So I did that this morning and moved several chairs out of the circle to make space. Maybe you can help that stay true by keeping some space open. And it's not just about accessibility in that regard. That's just one possible way, right? There are some other things we are doing and some other things we could be doing. Because every Sunday, I wonder about the inaccessibility of this pulpit to someone who can't navigate stairs or uses a scooter or a wheelchair to navigate the world. We have made some accommodations with an accessible T-loop for those who have hearing aids. We try to have the font in various kinds of colors and not other colors to be visible, and the sizes, but we're not there yet. This is not an accessible space. What would justice and equity look like in this circle with regard to full accessibility and inclusion, as the new recommended language says? And what does this year's stewardship need to look like? That is, what do each of us need to pledge if in our annual budget we covenant to use our time, wisdom, attention, and money to build and sustain fully accessible and inclusive communities? If we commit, as these new words, so the new language suggests, if we commit to work to be diverse, multicultural, beloved communities where all thrive, what does stewardship look like? What does ministry look like? What does everything we do take shape? How does that happen? We've got to keep our hearts wide open till our faith brings us back to solid ground. And racial justice is interconnected with disability justice, which is interconnected with climate justice. There are so many ways in which there is overlap and that we can work together to address it all.
The UUA's Side with Love campaign includes a staff person, Rachel Mislivey, who is the climate justice organizer. In her email this week, which you can sign up to receive so that you can learn more about all the amazing things that our denomination is working on, she names that there is an upcoming event called the UU Climate Revival, reimagined together from an extractive age to a new era. In her reflecting in preparation for this event, she wonders, how can we center love in the climate movement? For me, it's all about relationships. And in bold, she wrote, I do not want to build the world that is right for me. I want to collaboratively cultivate a world where all communities thrive. She continues, this means shifting from a singular mindset, a narrow focus, a myopic vision into an expansive reimagining, an abundance of possibility. And yes, friends, collective liberation for all. There is no quick and easy fix to the problems of our world today. For me, there are unbounded possibilities when I recognize that I alone do not have the answer. And that, my friends, is one of the reasons why religious community is crucial. Alone, none of us have the answers to these big challenges that we are facing as people and as a planet. But together, we can discover them and work for more justice and equity, so our faith brings some solid ground for all.